14th Amendment says no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. All right, well, what laws is it talking about?
Only the language of this bill can actually protect the preborn.
Pro-life movement has been saying for 50 years now, a fetus is a person, right? We're for treating them like persons. They're human beings from fertilization or from conception. But the pro-life bills don't actually treat them that way.
Well, hello everyone. Nicholas Callis here, the Executive Director of End Abortion Ohio. We don't have Austin or Matt with us today, but we do have a very special guest, and that is Bradley Pierce. Bradley Pierce is a constitutional attorney who wrote our bill, the Abolition of Abortion in Ohio Act. Bradley, thank you for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, of course. We have Bradley here for a couple days in Ohio. He spoke at an event at Cedarville University, and then he spoke at our event, the Rally for Equal Protection. Let me share a little bit more about who Bradley is. A lot of you who are listening will be familiar with Bradley. But Bradley has drafted dozens of equal protection bills filed to abolish abortion across the nation. And Bradley, as I mentioned earlier, is a constitutional attorney, and so he's been admitted to practice before the U.S. Supreme Court. And he actually filed a brief in Dobbs v. Jackson, the case that overturned Roe v. Wade. Bradley is often a guest on news outlets such as the Daily Wire, World News, and the Republican Sentinel, and many more as well. And he is the president of both the Foundation to Abolish Abortion and Abolish Abortion Texas. So in past episodes, we've touched on our bill, the Abolition of Abortion in Ohio Act, and explained basically what the bill does, but we haven't done an in-depth, exhaustive analysis of the bill. And that's more or less what I'd like to do today. So I'll be asking Bradley a bunch of questions, and we hope to make the case to you, the listener, why this is the bill that Ohio needs, and why only the language of this bill can actually protect the preborn under Ohio law. So I was thinking how we could do this, and I was thinking we could just read each section of the bill. It's a very short bill, only 2 pages, and then I'll ask Bradley questions about the bill. Sound good, Bradley?
That sounds great.
All right. So section 1, we have the preamble, the purpose, and it says, acknowledging the sanctity of innocent human life created in the image of God, which should be equally protected from the beginning of biological development to natural death. The purpose of this act is, then it goes on and on. And so, Bradley, what's the thought of including this preamble in the bill, and specifically using words such as the sanctity of life and the image of God?
Yeah, so one of the things that we try to do, a preamble is not necessary on a bill. It doesn't actually create law or change the law. It's basically just a summary of the bill, or it's also sometimes called a purpose clause, saying this is the purpose of this bill. This is what we're trying to do. And it helps people know, right, here's what you're about to read. Because sometimes when you get into the rest of the bill, there's legalese, right, we're amend this, repeal this, and kind of put it all together. We kind of do that in the purpose clause. So that's what's going on here. When we're talking about acknowledging the sanctity of innocent human life created in the image of God, we're trying to do what God calls us to do, which is in all your ways acknowledge me. Right? At the very beginning of this bill, we're trying to acknowledge God. Right? That's why we're doing what we're doing, because human life is precious, it's valuable, it's sacred. Right? Sanctity of innocent human life. And why is that? Because we're made in the image of God. And so that's why we say that there at the beginning of the bill.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, science can tell us that the preborn are humans, but science can't tell us why we should actually advocate for the equal protection of those preborn humans. And so we take our cues from the Word of God, and we're advocating for the equal protection under the law for the preborn because they are made in God's image. So the bill continues on, and Section 1, Clause A says to follow the Constitution of the United States, which requires that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Clause B, to fulfill such constitutional requirement by protecting the lives of preborn persons with the same criminal and civil laws protecting the lives of born persons, by repealing provisions that permit willful prenatal homicide or assault. So when I read this section, it seems that essentially the bill is an attempt to bring Ohio's treatment of the preborn in alignment with the United States Constitution. Is that correct, Bradley?
Yes, that's right. So the U.S. Constitution in the 14th Amendment, it says, among other things, it says no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Right? We've been, the pro-life movement has been saying for 50 years now, a fetus is a person. Right, we're for treating them like persons. They're human beings from fertilization or from conception, but the pro-life bills don't actually treat them that way by providing equal protection. So, 14th Amendment says no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. All right, well, what laws is it talking about? Well, earlier in the 14th Amendment it says that no state, that you can't deprive someone of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So we're at least talking about those laws that protect life, liberty, and property. So when it comes to life, laws that protect someone from homicide. So those need to be providing equal protection. What is equal protection? That just means that the same laws that protect my life from homicide need to protect your life from homicide, need to protect her life from homicide, need to protect our children's lives from homicide, and need to protect the lives of children who are not yet born from homicide, right? All of our lives are equally protected. That means that, again, it's not complicated. It just means that murdering anyone should be illegal for everyone.
Amen. So Bradley, as you know, in November, there's a pro-abortion constitutional amendment that will appear on Ohio's ballot. And if that passes, abortion through all 9 months will be a right enshrined in the Ohio Constitution. If that passes, what can this bill do?
Well, one thing that this bill can do, even if that does pass, this bill can help to set up a challenge to that law. I mean, obviously, if that ballot initiative passes after November 7th, and that goes into the Ohio Constitution, then if you pass this bill, then what you're probably going to see from the Ohio courts is they're going to come back and rule, well, no, this bill now violates the Ohio Constitution because it infringes on reproductive rights, etc. At that point, then, you would then appeal from there to the United States Supreme Court saying, no, right? Your new constitutional provision, Ohio, violates the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution, right? So you can amend the Ohio Constitution all you want, but you can't amend it to say something that violates the U.S. Constitution, which in this case says states cannot deny equal protection, which that's what this ballot initiative would require the state to do. And so passing this bill would just kind of bolster that argument and provide another opportunity to challenge that to the Supreme Court and get them to rule that a fetus is a person entitled to equal protection. Okay,
so basically what we need is to bring a personhood bill before the Supreme Court.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so if the pro-abortion ballot initiative does succeed in November, then End Abortion Ohio's strategy will be the same. We're going to continue to push this bill to apply the law equally to all persons, born and unborn. And if it gets struck down, then we will appeal and go through that process, hoping that this would present an opportunity for the Supreme Court to rule in favor of protecting preborn persons under the 14th
And of course,
Amendment.
if the Supreme Court does do that, that not only upholds this bill, which then abolishes abortion in Ohio, but by the Supreme Court ruling on that and finding that a fetus is a person entitled to equal protection, that would affect the whole country then. And then we would see, okay, now, no, it's not just Ohio. Every state is required to provide equal protection.
Right. Wonderful. So in Clause C of Section 1, the bill states to protect pregnant mothers from being pressured to abort by repealing provisions that may otherwise allow a person to direct, advise, encourage, or solicit a mother to abort her child. So what is this section about, and why is it important?
Most abortions take place because of a mother's choice, right? She's choosing to do something of her own free will. She's not under duress or anything like that. But there are a number of abortions that do take place where a mother's not being forced to do something against her will, although that does take place. That's extremely rare, but it does take place. But there's kind of a middle ground where a mother's not being forced, but she's being pressured, right? Or she's being encouraged strongly by her boyfriend, by her parents, by some outside party who's not doing anything illegal, right? They don't have a gun to her head. They're just saying, hey, if you don't abort, then I'll break up with you, or I'll kick you out of the house, or something like that. Right now, it's totally legal under Ohio law to pressure a woman to abort her child. Again, up to the point of like threatening violence against her. That's obviously illegal today, but right now it's perfectly legal to pressure a mother into an abortion, right? To say, hey, I'm going to cut off your money, I'm going to break up with you, I'm going to shame you, or etc. And so what this bill would do by providing equal protection and saying that the same homicide laws will protect born people, protect preborn people, it would automatically, not only would it make it illegal for the mother to abort her own child, it would make it illegal for anyone to even direct her to do that, or advise her to do that, or encourage or solicit her to do that. And that's because there's already existing Ohio law that makes it illegal to direct, advise, encourage, or solicit a person to commit a crime, especially a crime of homicide. And so that, some people say like, well, you're just focusing on the woman. What about the man, or what about other people involved who may be pressuring her? Well, yeah, this bill deals with all of that, right? Normally, we're kind of talking about the woman because that's who's normally getting the abortion, and that's who normally is being excluded from any kind of liability. But this makes it clear that this bill also applies to everybody else, right? Anybody else who's involved in encouraging or helping or pressuring a mother into an abortion would also be a criminal.
Okay. Yeah, so that would just be the same like with our standard homicide law. If I were to pressure my friend into murdering someone, then I would be criminally liable, correct?
Right, exactly.
And so why can't a pro-life bill protect mothers from being pressured to abort?
Because the pro-life bills always have an exception, or I should say not an exception, but there's an exclusion that they don't apply to the conduct committed by the mother. They always say that the mothers are not guilty, or the mothers are immune from any kind of criminal or civil, even like being sued, any kind of liability at all. And so what that does then is it means that self-managed abortion, right, do-it-yourself abortion, where there's no one directly assisting a mother in the abortion, she's just getting the pills and doing it herself. Under the pro-life bills, that's totally legal, which means that arguably it's totally legal to then pressure her to do that, right? Because it's generally not illegal to pressure someone to do something that's legal for them to do, right? If I'm trying to pressure you into going to let's go to a Cleveland Guardians game, right? I'm like, let's go, come on. If you don't go, I'm going to tell everybody here, that you're chicken or whatever. I'm going to pressure you into it. Yeah, that's not illegal. It's not illegal for me to pressure you into going to a baseball game because it's legal for you to go to a baseball game. Same thing here. It's not illegal to pressure a mother into an abortion when it's totally legal for her to get it, which it is even under the pro-life bills.
So we're going to actually get into self-managed abortions here in a moment with the next couple clauses. So in Clause D, the bill says to ensure that all persons potentially subject to such laws are entitled to due process protections, and Clause E, therefore, to abolish abortion in the state. So we've talked about how the bill essentially protects the lives of preborn persons with the same laws that protect born persons. And what may come as a surprise to some who are listening is that many in the pro-life movement will not support a bill of abolition because a bill that applies the law equally in the case of abortion means that those involved in the murder of a preborn child, including the mother, would be subject to prosecution. So, Bradley, I know we just talked about it a bit with the aspect of pressuring a mother into obtaining an abortion, but why should we apply the law equally here?
I mean, that's what equal protection means, right? If a mother, with calculation and design, which is the way that Ohio puts the aggravated murder law, with calculation and design, purposely, causes the death, let's say, of her 1-year-old child, that's aggravated murder. She's subject to prosecution. She's subject to civil liability if a mother were to do that to her 1-year-old. Why not for her child who's not yet born? If we say that the mother that she can be liable for killing her 1-year-old or for aggravated murder of her 1-year-old, but not for aggravated murder of her child before the child's born, in fact, she can be subject to zero liability, that's not equal protection, right? And that's what the Constitution requires, and yet that's what most pro-life bills, prohibit equal protection. They're not just silent about equal protection. They actually prohibit equal protection. So this purpose clause that we just read, to ensure that all persons potentially subject to such laws are entitled to due process protections. Right, so we want equal protection for the child, but then of course we want due process protections for the mother and anybody else who may be potentially criminally charged or civilly charged. Due process protections like you're entitled to an attorney, that you're entitled to a jury of your peers. You have a presumption of innocence, right? We're presuming that everyone's innocent until the government proves to the jury of their peers their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And then you get a sentencing, and then you get all the courts that review that, make sure that's not cruel and unusual, make sure it's not against the great weight of the evidence. All of those sorts of things, all those courts then consider and I'm not even mentioning half of the due process protections, right? Rules of evidence and all this stuff that protects defendants from being wrongfully convicted, and that doesn't do it perfectly, but does it really well. And that's called the justice system, and that's what we trust and we're grateful protects our own lives. And yes, it can be improved. We should work to improve it, but that's the justice system protecting our lives. And so equal protection would say, well, then that's the same justice system that should protect the preborn lives as well. And so again, not just protection for the child, but also due process for anyone potentially charged.
I think that was great, and I really appreciated how you explained that on Relatable with Allie Beth Stuckey. And your answer explains how there's a whole process involved with prosecution, and it's not just like we're going to go out and round up everyone who has ever committed a crime, or in this case, who has aborted their child. But all we're doing is we're saying that the law should be applied equally, and the processes that we would go through if we were being tried in a homicide case, those who are guilty of or those who obtain an abortion would also go through, correct?
Yes, yeah, and like you said, it wouldn't be rounding up, going backwards as well, right? None of this. I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit to the last part of the bill, section F here. It says the changes in law made by this act apply only to conduct that occurs on or after the effective date of this act, right? So no one would be going backwards to people that have had abortions in the past, where our law has told them it's legal, that's allowed. It would be unjust to go backwards and try to prosecute people. It would violate the Ohio Constitution, violate the U.S. Constitution. That would be called retroactive enforcement. Yeah, we can't do that. No one's asking for that. In fact, our bill says explicitly you can't do that. Right. But this would be just from whenever the bill becomes effective moving forward.
So, Bradley, you live in Texas, the great state of the Alamo and all of that great history there. There's been all kinds of claims that abortion has been essentially ended in Texas. Can you comment on that? Is that true or is that false?
I mean, it's true that those are the claims that are being made, but those claims are false. So in Texas, we have one of, if not the strongest, anti-abortion laws on the books in the country. And it's considered homicide for an abortion doctor or abortion clinic, Planned Parenthood, to perform an abortion from fertilization. And there's even civil penalties to the attorney general can enforce if there's not local enforcement, and they can get penalties up to $100,000 in addition to it being homicide. And so there's a number of good protections there for those clinic abortions. The problem is that the current law in Texas, and this is the case in 14, what are often referred to as abortion-free states. In all 14 of these states, Texas included, these laws have explicit exclusions for the mother, like we talked about earlier, that says this law doesn't apply to the mother. By putting that in there, it then makes it legal for mothers to obtain and to take abortion pills and to have do-it-yourself abortions, or otherwise known as self-managed abortions, at home. And they're doing it by the tens of thousands. We believe it's about 80,000, at least 80,000 a year across those 14 states. In Texas, it's at least 19,000. And so we're seeing that across the country, that there's still children being killed on the soil of abortion-free, quote-unquote, states because the pro-life laws explicitly allow for that.
So I know you did a debate with Samuel Say recently, and I didn't watch the debate from what I heard, it sounded like Samuel Say was arguing that we can still abolish abortion without prosecuting mothers. Is that what his argument was, and how would you respond to that?
I don't know that was really his argument. I think he was throwing that out there as kind of a thought experiment, if you will. I think he agreed with equal protection, that mothers, there does need to be criminal liability for mothers. I think what he was trying to say is, okay, well, what if we can't get that, but we can get a bill that does kind of what the Texas law currently does, which is it bans everything but self-managed abortion, or the way he put it, like it bans all abortion, but it doesn't have penalty for the mother. Would you support that? Was what he was asking. And I said, my response was, well, that bill still allows every child in the state to be legally murdered as long as their mother does it themselves. And so, no, I don't support a bill that shows partiality, or I think God would call it. God says, do not show partiality in judgment, which means regarding, in Hebrew word means regarding faces, right? Which is you're looking at the identity of the alleged perpetrator and you're looking at the identity of the victim to decide the case. Whenever you're not supposed to be looking at people's identities when you're deciding cases, you're supposed to be looking at what are the facts of the case. What did they do and why did they do it? Whether they're rich or poor or red or yellow, black or white, or man or woman or old or young or weak or powerful, or in this case, born or not yet born, should not be a factor in determining guilt or innocence in a case. But that's called partiality when we do that. God forbids it. That's why, like, statues of justice, why we say Lady Justice, a statue, she has a blindfold on because she's supposed to be weighing out justice based upon the facts, not based upon looking at the people. So whenever we write a bill that says, no, it's illegal for moms to kill their babies unless, or it's illegal for women to kill babies unless it's her baby and the baby's not yet born. And that's what these bills essentially say. And I would say, yeah, no, we can't support that. And ultimately, it's doesn't really save the lives that people act like it does.
Right. Yeah, like you mentioned in Texas, self-managed abortion is blossoming, it's flourishing.
Right.
And I know we've mentioned this on previous podcasts, but we consider the abortion industry to be like a tree. We can't prune the branches. We have to cut down the root.
Right.
So that there is no ability for abortion to continue legally, as we're seeing in these quote-unquote abortion-free states.
Yeah, and when using that analogy, when you say, okay, you can't go get an abortion at a clinic, right, you're cutting off a major branch, but what's the tree going to do? It's just going to direct its resources to the branches that's left, and now the branches left is just going to get bigger and replace, the size of the one that it lost. And that's what we're seeing with self-managed abortion, right? That we believe about 80% of abortions that were happening in those abortion-free states are still happening. They've just shifted from clinics to self-managed abortion. And people are like, oh, well, there's 20%, that aren't happening. Maybe. We don't really have all the data on it because people are doing it at home. But even so, I think it's going to keep increasing. And I think it's going to overtake the numbers that have been saved, supposedly, by cutting off the clinics. And we're seeing across the country, abortion numbers are actually up since Dobbs overturned Roe versus Wade. New York Times said 6 days ago that abortion numbers in 2020 across all 50 states and D.C. were 465,000 in 6 months, so half the year. But this first half of 2023, 511,000 abortions across 36 states. So we have a higher, even though we're counting 14 fewer states, we have more abortions going on. That doesn't even count what we believe, at least 40,000 over those 6 months abortions taking place in those other 14 states. So whatever we're doing, even if our goal, obviously we want to save the babies, but it's not, right? Numbers overall are up higher than they were even before the Dobbs decision overturned Roe.
That's great. We talked to a decent amount of people who aren't quite, completely sold out for abolition, but they're not like in the typical pro-life, camp. But one of the reasons why they would be willing to support a bill of partiality is because they want to save those babies. Right. But what you're saying is that, well, actually, those bills don't save babies, and they won't save babies in the long run. Or they might save a few lives here and there, but in the long run, it's still allowing abortion to continue via chemical pills or some other method. Yeah,
again, I think it could be saving some babies in the short term, and praise God for every single baby saved. But I think, just because babies are being saved doesn't mean that what we're doing is right. Right? We still have to make sure that the way that we're going about it is lawful. And we also may look at it and say, like, oh, well, there's babies being saved. But what we're doing is actually undermining our arguments, and we're compromising our principles. So we're actually losing the cultural battle, which is going to lead to, abortion continuing much, much, much longer, which leads to more babies dying. The way that I look at it is, I was talking with someone about this earlier, the whole idea that, hey, we're going to do these increments that, yes, they show partiality, yes, they compromise our principles, they undermine our arguments, but they save some babies. I would say to those people, in addition to kind of the rest of our discussion, I would say, how's that working out for you? Right? That we've been doing that for 50 years.
Right.
And we still have babies being killed by the millions. We have 65 million babies that have been killed, just reported. That doesn't even count all the ones not reported. And now we're on pace this year, 2023, for over 1.1 million abortions, which is more than we've had in 13 years. I would say to folks kind of doing what we've always done, I'd say, how's that working out for you? Right? Even if, like, saving babies is the ultimate standard, which I would say, in some ways, yes, we want that, but it's establishing justice and doing it without violating God's law. That's what we want. Yes, to save babies. That's the result. But I would say, how's that working? It's not really working very well, and that's a strategy we've been doing for 50 years, and it's not really working very well.
So in April of 2022, the Gospel Coalition released an article titled "Should Women Be Prosecuted for Self-Induced Abortions?" And the author concluded that the prudent strategy for pursuing proximate justice is to forego the punishment of the women who have an abortion so that we can punish the abortionist. He writes that the purpose of foregoing prosecution of the mother is not to let them evade the moral consequences of their actions, but to help ensure the principal criminal, the abortionist, would be identified, prosecuted, and brought to justice. And he goes on to explain in common law tradition that if a woman was a co-conspirator with the abortionist, then the abortionist would not be able to be prosecuted solely on her testimony. I know we are sort of staying in this section of the bill, or that at least we have been for a while, but I think it's important to kind of get into the weeds of this and hash this out, because this is something that people really take an issue with and something that's really important, of course. So how would you respond to that argument?
I would say that argument is largely obsolete. So, historically, whenever you're charging two people who are co-conspirators to a crime, whenever you're trying to prosecute them, there's a rule of evidence in most places that says you can't convict based upon the testimony of a co-conspirator alone, right? Because they're obviously, they're being charged with a crime, so they're not the most credible person here, and they may have selfish reasons for that. So you need to have evidence that corroborates, is the way the rule of evidence says, corroborates the testimony of the co-conspirator. So that was one of the rationales for why pro-life bills, even before Roe, did not apply to the mother in most states. There were some where it still did, but in most states it didn't. And that was one of the rationales. They said that, well, we really want to go after these abortionists. We really need the testimony of the mother in order to prosecute and get a conviction. But if the mother's a co-conspirator, then there's rule of evidence that says we have to have corroborating evidence. Historically, that's been pretty hard to find. It's been harder. It's just made it harder, right? Because you still have to have evidence that there was a baby, the baby was alive before the abortionists did their procedure, and then afterwards the baby was dead, right? So you got to prove all those things. Proving that with something other than the testimony of the mother, it was harder back then than it is today. Today, though, the reason why I say it's obsolete today, though, with forensic evidence, with ultrasounds, with all the technology that we have at our disposal today, we don't really even need the testimony of the mother as much. And even with it, it's easy to corroborate it, right? It's easy to meet this standard that you have to have corroborating evidence. And so I think that the argument that whoever's making that with the Gospel Coalition there, I think they're using an old argument that, it's obsolete. It really doesn't apply to our situation today. So I don't think that really holds a lot of water anymore.
Yeah, no, thank you for explaining that. So that was Section 1 of the bill. Section 2, it starts off, and it says, Section 2903.11 of the Revised Code to be enacted to read as follows. This section may be cited as the Abolition of Abortion, Ohio Act. In this chapter, the terms person or another shall include an individual living human child before birth, from the beginning of biological development, at the moment of fertilization, upon the fusion of a human, how do you say that?
Spermatozoon.
Spermatozoon, thank you.
Spermatozoon. People pronounce it different ways.
With a human ovum? Ovum?
Yes, ovum.
Okay. So, thank you. I I took Greek in school, so I should know this.
Well, these are Latin. So.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not that advanced yet. But
there you go.
Why is this personhood language so important to be like? Why should we apply that to the preborn? And with that, pro-life bills that don't recognize personhood, why do those fail?
So this section, I know it's got some big words and some 50-cent lawyer legalese words here, but it's really very simple. There's already laws against homicide, against aggravated murder, manslaughter, vehicular manslaughter, negligent homicide, criminally negligent homicide. There's already all these laws that prohibit the homicide, and they already prohibit homicide of whom, right? Not, animals and things like that, although there are laws there too. But in this case, they're protecting the homicide, prohibiting the homicide of persons. So all we're doing in this subsection here is saying that includes preborn persons. That definition of person includes preborn persons from the moment of fertilization, right? From the moment when the sperm meets the egg, or as it puts it here, the fusion of a human spermatozoon with a human ovum with the egg. So when the sperm and the egg come together, you have fertilization at that moment. At that moment, you cannot aggravated murder that person or murder that person or etc. So that's what this section does.
And so the language seems very intentional. The bill specifies that personhood begins at the moment of fertilization. Why don't we use the language of conception?
Yeah, the language of conception is a good term, and I think most people, when you hear conception, would think that conception and fertilization, when the sperm and egg come together, well, that's the same thing. I think if you go ask the average person when does conception happen, they would say when the sperm and the egg come together. The reason why we want to be a little more specific and use the word fertilization instead of conception is because there are members of the medical community or even the Federal Drug Administration that use a different definition of conception because they want to be able to sell contraceptives that are actually abortifacients, but they don't want to call them abortifacients. They want to call them contraceptives. So they actually define conception as taking place not when the sperm and the egg come together, but when the human life, descends the fallopian tube and actually implants into the uterus. So instead of saying conception begins at fertilization, which is I think what the average person is going to think conception means, some of the medical community, and I think it's still today a minority, but then the FDA, they define conception as beginning at implantation, and so that's why we're very intentional to use the word fertilization, just to make clear. No, when the sperm and the egg meet and join together, that's when there's a new human life that should be protected by law.
So a follow-up question to that I think is impacted by the language of fertilization versus conception is having to do with a concern that we've heard from different lawmakers, and that concern has been about how this bill would affect IVF and birth control. Can you comment on how this bill would affect those practices?
Yeah, so the bill would not explicitly prohibit IVF, right? IVF, which is where you take a sperm and an egg and join them together, and then you seek to implant them into the uterus of a mother. It's basically just a way of creating an embryo and then seeking for that embryo to implant into the mother. This bill would not prohibit that, right? Because there's nothing there that would involve intentionally destroying a human life. No, you're trying to create life and then do the IVF. The problem is that most, close to all of the IVF community, that's not how they actually operate. They're not actually just, right, taking one sperm and one egg, putting them together, creating one embryo, putting that embryo in the mother. If that doesn't work, if it doesn't implant, okay, now we try one more, right? What they're actually doing is creating multiple embryos, and then they may try to implant, or may try to put in the mother two at a time, and if one of them implants, great. But then what do they do with all the other embryos? Well, normally they will analyze them, and the ones that appear to be weaker, they will discard those, or they'll donate them to science, or they'll be destroyed through experiments. And then even the stronger ones will be cryogenically frozen indefinitely until the mother wants to try to implant them again. Or the mother could at some point say, you know what, no, we don't want them anymore, go ahead and destroy them.
Wow.
So that's what's going on. So we have human beings that are being created in labs, which that has its own issues, the ethical issues to talk about. But the bill actually doesn't prohibit the creation of human beings. But what it would prohibit is the destruction of those human beings, which would dramatically, it would require the IVF community to dramatically change their practices from what they're doing right now. Because right now they are intentionally destroying a lot of embryos.
Would there have to be successive bills that explicitly deal with how IVF would be conducted in an ethical way then?
I don't know that there would have to be. At least under this bill, it would just say, hey, you can do it however, as long as you're not intentionally, knowingly, recklessly, or negligently causing the death of these embryos. So kind of they would then be up to the IVF community to kind of develop their own standards that would then, prevent that, if they can do that.
So what about birth control?
So birth control, so there's contraception and then there's birth control, and those are really two different things. It's kind of like contraception is a subset of birth control. Contraception, again, comes from a couple of words. Contra, meaning against, and conception, right? It's against conception. So when you hear contraception, you think, oh, it's against conception. It's preventing conception, which would be like condom prevents conception because it prevents the sperm from getting to the egg. Mm-hmm. Spermicide, because it destroys the sperm before they can get to the egg. Or something that in some ways prevents the sperm and the egg from joining together. That would be something that's truly a contraceptive. This bill would not in any way outlaw any of that, right? Our concern is not with destroying sperm or even destroying eggs. That's not homicide to do that. That's still, the sperm is still, although separate from, it's still technically part of the man's body, and the egg's still technically part of the woman's body. But it's when they come together that you no longer, it's no longer the man's body or the woman's body. It's now a new body. It's now a new human being. At that point, there are things that are marketed as contraceptives because of the different definition that the FDA and some of the medical community uses of conception. Things that are marketed as contraception that are actually, they're not just trying to keep the sperm from getting to the egg and uniting. They're actually designed to prevent that new human embryo from implanting into the mother's uterus, which is intentionally starves that embryo of oxygen and nutrients and a safe place to thrive, which is what every human being needs in order to live. And so those things they're not just contraceptives, they're actually abortifacients. And so any of those that are used, right, because for a crime you have to have intent, right? There has to be some criminal mind as well as a criminal action, right? So we have it; those things are abortifacient. So if any of these drugs are used with that intent to prevent that embryo from implanting, that would be prohibited by the bill. And again, that I'm not a doctor. I don't know what all that would apply to, but I think it would probably apply to IUDs. Or at least many IUDs. It would certainly apply to Plan B, the morning after pill, things like that.
So this has sort of the potential to radically change how we think of birth control and contraception in our society.
Yes, and I think we should have a radical, reevaluation of how we're doing that.
Sure.
So
Sure. Yeah, it seems like those are so prolific in our society that it's so rooted. Our society is so rooted in those practices that this bill would really be countercultural, more so than what we're already, more so than what we might already think it would be.
I think so. We've gotten so far away from having a biblical or Christian ethic on life, or even on babies. It's going to take a while to get back to where we should be.
Yeah. Well, all right. I know we are running out of time here, so got about 2 or 3 more questions left. Let's go to the next part of Section 2. And the section starts off, it says, nothing in this chapter shall apply to a lawful medical procedure, 1, performed by a licensed physician, 2, performed on a pregnant woman to avert the death of the pregnant woman, 3, that results in the accidental or unintentional death of the unborn child the pregnant woman is carrying, and 4, performed when all reasonable alternatives to save the life of the unborn are unavailable or were attempted unsuccessfully before the performance of the medical procedure. Goes on to say, nothing in this chapter shall be misconstrued or shall be construed to allow for prosecution for a spontaneous miscarriage. So Bradley, can you explain why this section does not permit an exception to abortion?
Yeah, so this section, I think the most obvious application would be an ectopic pregnancy, which ectopic pregnancies happen. They're not, the majority of pregnancies, but, they do happen occasionally. Typically, when an ectopic pregnancy is discovered, the baby has already died. But there are some cases, rare, where they discover them and the baby is still alive. So, and again, there may be some other circumstances, but that's kind of the most commonly known circumstance that this would apply to. Doctors can do what they need to do to save the life of the mother, as long as they're treating the baby and the mother as patients, seeking to save as many lives as they possibly can, and doing everything that they possibly can for both, right? Exhausting all reasonable avenues to save the life of the child. So as long as they're doing that, then there's no criminal liability there. If they're we're trying to write it in a way that it doesn't turn into a loophole for abortion, right?
Right.
So this is someone who their intent is to save life, right? They're not trying to abort a child. They're trying to save both the life of the child and the mother, trying to save as many lives as possible. And that's why this isn't an abortion, right? It may be, some people might medically code it as an abortion, just like in the, if you go to a hospital for a miscarriage, it's often coded in the medical codes as a spontaneous abortion, right? That's just kind of the medical terminology, but that's not the legal terminology. And legally speaking, an abortion is not, is not the removal of an ectopic pregnancy. In fact, most states that define abortion, that discuss it, say exactly that. That's not included in the definition of abortion. Why? Because that's not the intent of abortion, right? So that's what our bill does as well. And so that's why I'd say it's not an exception, because this is not an exception to an abortion. The purpose of an abortion is to take life. Okay, well that's not the purpose of this. The purpose of this is to save life, so it's not an exception.
Yeah. Thank you. That is very helpful. So one last section of the bill, Section 2, Clause G, I believe we might have skipped one, but it says existing provisions relating to prenatal homicide or regulating abortion or abortion facilities are not repealed, but are superseded to the extent that such provisions may conflict with or may be inconsistent with this act. So what is this section saying, and why is the language not repealed, but are superseded?
Yeah, so there's other, like we've talked about, there's pro-life laws that are on the books. Here in Ohio, for example, we have the post-viability ban. Once a baby reaches viability, abortion is banned in the state. That's the existing law today, being enforced today. Not that I don't know that that's saving any babies, but because they just get their abortions beforehand. And I think, there's even, exceptions after. Then there's the Heartbeat Act here in Ohio, which is currently stayed by court, awaiting the ruling from the Ohio Supreme Court. That's on the books. Partial birth abortion ban, things like that are on the books in Ohio. This bill doesn't disturb any of those. Those laws would continue to, if this bill gets passed, those laws would continue to remain on the books. They would be obsolete because, once you've abolished abortion and made murdering anyone illegal for everyone, we don't really need a partial birth abortion ban or a post-viability ban or a heartbeat ban anymore. We don't need them, but they're still there. They're still on the books. So this part of the bill just says, hey, we're not touching those. Those will stay on the books, because I know there's some people that are concerned, well, wait a second, if this bill passes, and if we repeal those, then if this bill gets overturned, then we have no laws on the books, and now we have abortion on demand. So by just superseding it, instead of repealing those to kind of clean them up, we just leave them there. So that way, with someone's argument that, hey, we're repealing these laws that are like safety nets, if this law doesn't hold up, we're just leaving those alone. So that way, worst case scenario, again, I don't think it's the way that it's written that would happen, but helps to allay the concerns of those who think that could happen, that we go ahead and leave those on the books. Yeah,
gotcha. Bradley, any other thoughts on the bill or any other thoughts for Ohio?
I hope that there's a legislator in Ohio willing to have the courage to put a bill like this forward. To me, it should be really a simple thing to do. Again, it's what are the laws that protect our lives? All we're trying to do here is say, well, those laws should be the same laws to protect the life of people before they're born. It seems simple. And if we say that a fetus is a person from the moment of fertilization, then why is that so hard? So I hope someone has the courage to put that forward, and I hope that Christians will unite around it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Bradley, for coming on the podcast today and for your help in Ohio these past couple of days. Obviously, those who are listening will hear this from a later date, but Bradley was able to speak at several events in Ohio, September 12th and 13th, and we really appreciated his presence and his help, especially as we gear up to find another sponsor for the Abolition of Abortion in Ohio Act, and as we gear up to defeat this pro-abortion ballot initiative in November. So that's Bradley Pierce for you all. Thank you so much for listening.